Chapter 11, June 1918. When Dr. Harvey left his office for lunch, he noticed three young boys, probably 10 or 11 years of age, on the sidewalk. They were walking quickly and turned right, out of sight onto Ninth Avenue. He imagined they were on their way to retrieve fishing poles before spending the afternoon in a shady spot near the Yellowstone River. The river was swollen by late spring, snow melt, and unusually heavy rains, and many of the usual fishing spots were not safely accessible. Seeing the boys in the early afternoon reminded him school was out for the summer. During the spring, he and school officials had conferred several times regarding quarantine steps after he had diagnosed measles in a schoolchild. He was relieved knowing large groups of schoolchildren would no longer be congregating at school daily for the next 3 months. If a case of measles occurred in a school-aged child, school would no longer be a place for other children to be exposed. On his way to the cafe, he met the legislator, Arthur Elliott, who said, "Good day, doctor." Arthur was wearing Levi Strauss denims, a long-sleeved cotton shirt, and well-worn boots. This attire was less formal than usual for a politician whose appearance was as much a hallmark as his bravado. Dr. Harvey replied, "Good day to you. It must be nice to be home after all the activity in Helena this year." Arthur boomed in reply, as if launching a stump speech. "Indeed, it is wonderful to be home. This is the best place on earth, especially after dealing with the turmoil at the legislature." He paused momentarily as if to arrange his thoughts before proceeding. A special session it was. We needed to take action before seditious sabotage spread any further. Dr. Harvey admired the use of this alliteration, but he knew he would be less impressed by the logic in what came next. The legislator continued. If that damn Borquin had protected America and not supported the likes of a disloyal rancher, and if our damnable neighbor Crum was not collaborating with the Hun helpers around here, we wouldn't have needed a special legislative session. But by God, we have now made it clear Montanans can identify traitors, and we need to put them away at Deer Lodge if need be. The soliloquy was reaching a crescendo. And as you know, we required counties to have guns registered too. If push came to shove with the traitors and sympathizers, county sheriffs would at least know where the weaponry is. While he listened to Arthur expound, Dr. Harvey recalled events which he had read differing versions in the town's two newspapers, and heard more than one point of view from folks around town. George Borquin, the judge of the Butte County District Court, was being widely criticized by groups, feeling there should be more prosecutions of those accused of being traitors. Chief among these groups was the Montana Council of Defense. It had been established when President Wilson asked each state to create a council to help with the war effort. The council in Montana, with enthusiastic support of county councils of defense, including one in Rosebud counties, had focused on identifying and accusing alleged traitors. One of the accused was a rancher, Vess Hall, from southern Rosebud County. He had strongly criticized American involvement in the war. The Rosebud County attorney had been designated to argue the case against Mr. Hall. The trial was first scheduled for Billings, but subsequently moved to Helena. Judge Borquin heard the Hall case and determined no law had been broken, no matter how provocative the statements made by the German rancher. Judge Crum from Forsyth had testified on behalf of Mr. Hall. The Montana Council of Defense and its supporters were livid about the Hall decision. They pushed for a special session of the legislature. The session had been held in February. At that session, the legislator had impeached Judge Crum, despite the fact he had resigned prior to the legislative hearing. Dr. Harvey had felt the impeachment proceeding was probably not necessary, but it was certainly unfortunate because at the time Crum was trying to help care for his son who had cancer. The legislatures also had enacted a Montana sedation law and a gun registration law during the special session. The Montana law had been a model for the recently passed Federal Sedation Act of 1918. In Montana, use of the German language had been banned. German textbooks had been burned in Lewistown, and one pastor had to seek an exception to the ban in order to preach to his church members who spoke only German. Arthur Elliott and his like-minded colleagues had been very busy thus far in 1918. He asked the legislator, "How strong was the evidence that Vess Hall is a danger to our country?" Judge Borquin seemed to conclude there was no clear danger nor evidence for espionage, at least in the account I read in the Democrat. Arthur stood even more erect than his usual perpendicular posture and fired back. Jesus, Doctor, have you been reading that apologist rag of a newspaper? At least half a dozen people heard Hall disparage our country's war preparation, and he said he wouldn't register for a draft. There was eyewitness testimony at the trial. Borquin ignored the evidence and turned the bastard loose, so we tightened the law at the special session. Made it harder for judges like Borquin to stand in the way of justice. Dr. Harvey decided to ask another question, even though he anticipated a similarly vitriolic reply. Was an impeachment hearing for Judge Crum really necessary? I understand he resigned his position before the hearing began. Arthur took a deep breath and appeared as puffed up as a sage-grouse rooster before saying, Damn if you haven't been spending too much time reading that rag. Of course we had to impeach Crum. Set an example for other judges who might consider supporting traitors. Should do the same for Borquin, but Wheeler keeps standing in the way. We need to get that wobbly lover unappointed too. And doctor, let me offer you some friendly advice. You might want to pay more attention to the coverage in the Times Journal and not rely on the slanted views published in the Democrat. Then the line of questioning you pursue might not be mistaken as sympathetic to the sedation occurring in our country. Dr. Harvey demurred and replied only after a long pause. He wondered if Elliot realized that the Levi denims he was wearing were designed by an immigrant from Bavaria. Dr. Harvey had read of threats to launch more judicial proceedings and a venomous criticism of Burton Wheeler, the federal district attorney in Montana. He said, Good to see you today. Good to see you as well, Doctor, replied the legislator, glancing at his pocket watch. Please excuse me, I'm due at a meeting at the Masonic Temple. They nodded at each other as Arthur Elliot began walking east toward the Masonic building and Dr. Harvey west to the cafe. He thought the parting much less friendly than the greeting had been. His concern about the intensity of hateful accusations levied against some county residents was further heightened. At the cafe, a cheerful and ever-optimistic Alice greeted him. He felt this to be a therapeutic bonus to accompany whatever he ordered for a meal. As he sat in the folk-back wooden chair at the table by the window, Herman Mueller stepped into the cafe. The German rancher asked the waitress, Have you a place I can sit to have lunch? Of course, Mr. Mueller. You are always welcome here, she replied. Are you by yourself today? Yeah, I'm by myself, he answered. Dr. Harvey stood again and said, Perhaps you would join me at this table. I'm about to order a sandwich. I would enjoy talking with you if you would join me. Herman replied, I would like to talk. Danke. Thank you for offering. When the two men were seated, the waitress asked, Would you like coffee or maybe a lemonade on a day like this? The rancher asked for coffee, no cream, no sugar, and Dr. Harvey requested lemonade, which sounded very appealing to him. The waitress asked, Do you know already what you would like to order? Dr. Harvey responded, I would like a hamburger, please, as usual, not too well done. Alice looked at him and said, I will place the order, and I know you enjoy the sandwich. Let me mention something so if you hear the chef call me when the sandwich is ready, you will know I placed the right order. The sandwich is now being called a ground beef sandwich rather than a hamburger. The owner received a notice from the local loyalty league discouraging the use of German language or words with German connotations. The letter includes examples, and hamburger was on the list, and so was sauerkraut. The league suggested naming these items Liberty Steak and Liberty Cabbage. At first, our owner dismissed the notice, but he decided to comply with some suggestions as he heard more and more stories of loyalty leagues around the state bringing sedation charges against people judged to be transgressors. In the end, he thought ground beef sandwich was a sufficient name change. She paused briefly and looked at Herman and continued, I am sorry this is happening. I assure you, though, you are welcome here, and we appreciate your business. Dr. Harvey was disgusted by the logic apparently used to change the name of a sandwich. He said, Thank you for telling me this. Since hamburgers are not available at this time, I would like to change my order. May I have a ham sandwich with a slice of cheese in the sandwich, too? Herman said, I would also like a ham sandwich with a slice of cheese. Alice replied, Of course, gentlemen, I will take the orders to the kitchen now. Would either of you like to have a bowl of potato soup to go with your sandwich? The soup was prepared this morning, and it is delicious." Both men shook their heads to decline. Alice walked to the kitchen and a few minutes later returned with coffee and lemonade. Dr. Harvey had begun a discussion with the rancher by simply asking how he and his family were doing. At first, the reply had been very general. "Getting by, doing well," the rancher had replied. However, Dr. Harvey found these responses unconvincing. He asked, "Have you or your family been troubled by the unfortunate activities such as Loyalty League investigations underway in this county since the Montana sedation law was passed by the state legislature?" Herman began describing some events. Dr. Harvey perceived relief, understandable relief, within the burdened man as the discussion continued. Herman mentioned, "Gerd is doing much better since you and the nurse visited. She especially enjoys the days the nurse comes to talk with her. I'm grateful for what you have done, but there is still trouble. She worries for us." Dr. Harvey queried, "Worries for you?" Herman continued, "Ja, our neighbor does not visit us now and does not invite us to dinner on Sunday any longer. When we visit town, we hear when people call us Krauts and Kaiser followers. Some merchants do not welcome us like they did before the war. At church, a deacon took me aside and told me to stop singing hymns off Deutsch. Mein Frau liebet the way the hymns sound off Deutsch. Now we sing them off Deutsch at home, but not in church. And mein fence has been damaged on purpose. I am sure not by accident. This allows my cattle to leave my pastures and move to my neighbor's pastures. I do not want my cattle to cause trouble, so I ride my fence line each morning to mend damaged spots. Gerd Weiss dice these things. She cares for us." Dr. Harvey asked, "Have you reported the fence damage to the sheriff?" Herman looked even more concerned than he had before. He replied, "I did tell the deputy sheriff, but he asked how I could be sure the damage was not caused by my cattle. Cattle do not cut wires. They do not break fence posts this way." I did not want to talk to him further. He was only interested in whether I had reported all my guns to the sheriff. I told him the only guns I had were 2 rifles, and I had reported these to the sheriff in April when I learned of the registration requirement. I do not think the deputy sheriff believed me. He told me to forget the June deadline and register all guns. He said he would be enforcing the law, and violators, liars, he said, would be prosecuted. I have not talked any more with him or the sheriff. Dr. Harvey felt a mix of anger and sadness about the events unfolding this year. He said, "I can understand why you would not want to talk any further with either of them. I feel bad knowing what you and your family are going through. I hope this war ends soon and everyone in this community returns to caring for and supporting their neighbors." The rancher replied with a skeptical tone, "It ought to, I hope, the war ends soon. Gerd is also very worried about her mother and siblings." The waitress came with the ham sandwiches and asked, "Any more coffee or lemonade?" Both men indicated yes and began eating their sandwiches. While they ate, the men talked about crop growth and weather, but Dr. Harvey kept thinking about the way some had turned against their neighbors. This left a sour taste in his mouth, much more sour than the lemonade he was drinking. He was afraid these events were likely to be amplified as the war went on, especially when reports of U.S. casualties came to Rosebud County. The American expeditionary forces were on the front line now. Casualties and severe injuries were certain to occur. He wondered if these toxic feelings and actions were happening elsewhere in Montana, or if Montana was the only place sedation fever was spreading. He knew, though, this epidemic of hatefulness and hurt must be spreading like an infection throughout the country. He had read of a German man named Prager who had been hung by a mob in East St. Louis. A government official there seemed to have justified the lynching by observing the residents had done so because they had felt the government would not punish his disloyalty. Was Montana more affected than elsewhere? Did Rosebud County have the most virulent form of this malady? These thoughts disturbed him. After the men finished the sandwiches, they thanked the waitress for her excellent service. Dr. Harvey paid both, despite Herman's objection. He prevailed in the brief discussion of how the bill would be paid by suggesting they meet for lunch again, and Herman would pay for both meals then. As they stood and prepared to leave, the deputy sheriff walked by the window and looked into the cafe. Dr. Harvey perceived a menacing look, but realized his own perception might be biased, influenced by the disturbing things he had heard from the rancher. Would he himself become more involved with the affliction, turning neighbor against neighbor? They left the cafe. Herman went to his Ford parked less than a block away. Dr. Harvey returned to his office for another busy afternoon, seeing patients with a variety of diseases and discomforts. When he saw these patients, he wondered how the community's affliction was affecting them, and if some might be perpetrating the spread of this affliction.